Christianity, have we got a treat for you. My name is Bo Sanders, and earlier this month, my partner Tripp and I got to sit down with the New York Times #1 best-selling author, Reza Aslan, to talk about his book, Sell It, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. This was a live event hosted on the west side of LA at a church that I'm a part of called the Loft LA. We want to thank everyone who made this evening work. Our house band for the evening was the Young Romans. You'll get to hear a little bit of their music in the intros, and at the end, we encourage you to go support their work. You can get their album on iTunes and on Amazon. The Young Romans. Reza Aslan's book is a subject of much controversy. He has been on The Daily Show and Colbert. He was on that infamous Fox News interview that didn't go so well. We asked him about that a little bit at the end. We want to thank Reza and his people for making this evening happen. You will notice that he was right at home with our rowdy style. He fit right in. It was a fantastic, fun evening of conversation. And anytime you get a house full of people talking about Jesus and why Jesus' life matters and how that affects the world that we live in, that is a good evening. So if you like what you hear, you can subscribe to Homebrewed Christianity on iTunes, on Stitcher, or on the website. We have several shows. One of the other shows is Tripp and I talking in his garage. It's called the Theology Nerd Throwdown. We also have the Culture Cast and Unfolded, which is a narrative, kind of a Radio Lab style storytelling podcast. We would love to get your feedback on this conversation. If you go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com, on the right-hand side is a little microphone icon. You click it, and you can leave us an MP3 message with questions or concerns or comments, and we use those in upcoming episodes when we do call-in shows, and we give some feedback on that. So please jump in and join the conversation. But for right now, enjoy talking with Reza Aslan about the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth.
I forget a world of things, and when you're right here, my dark side to sing, and I come alive tonight. I would die for that to be enough, and I come alive tonight. I put my arms around the one, and I come alive tonight. I would die for that to be enough, and I come alive tonight. I put my arms around the one I love. Around the one
All right, well, my name is Tripp.
My name is Bo.
This is Homebrewed Christianity Podcast.
We do these live events. They're 3D broadcasts of our show.
It's like low-tech 3D, so you don't have to wear special glasses.
Yeah, no glasses
You just get
required.
to experience all of our flesh.
Yeah, there's a lot of flesh, lot of hair, a lot of sweat.
Bo and I, we've been doing this podcast since 2008. We've had over 300 episodes each month. 50,000 different people listen to at least one of the podcasts. So it's kind of like we're the second biggest like Jesus-related thing on the internet where you can download stuff, and Jesus doesn't want you to hate gay people. We like people in other religions. We want to care for the planet and help the poor.
Well
really
said.
Crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Christina Tippett keeps beating us, and that
I know she. Yeah, On Being is #1. We all concede that. But it turns out that next to her, she's amazing.
Yeah.
Unless you're a megachurch, we are the next best stop on the internet for progressive Christianity.
Yeah, there you go. That's sad about...
It's not bad. We're number 2. We are number 2.
Oh, yeah.
We'll take it.
And the
not
whole
bad.
idea is basically that I like beer a lot. And I like good beer.
True.
And when you're in college, you find out that beer exists. People start giving you this thing called Pabst Blue Ribbon. Now, hundreds of years ago, it reportedly won a blue ribbon because someone liked it.
It was a long time ago.
Yes. And they have been regurgitating that thing they call beer that kind of affects you in large quantities if you hang upside down over a keg for an extended period of time.
If you drink it upside down, it works faster.
It works, yes. It's like the Pentecostal experience. And so, and my theory is, when I found out it didn't have to taste like chilled pea, beer that is.
I know.
And then there are good ones, and I wanted to learn how to make it. And when you start learning how to make beer, you can make all sorts of different flavors and styles, and your taste buds can just pop.
It depends on the ingredients and the process.
Yeah, and so my thought was, well, we got a lot of people that are rocking PBR Christianity. It was like really awesome in the 16th century. It totally fit that game. And the thing is, they keep running around with a blue ribbon on it called Calvin's Institutes or something like that, and they're like, "This was great." And I was like, "No, we're just going to interview nerds and let everyone else brew their own faith, and hopefully one that isn't the theological equivalent of chilled urine."
Yeah. So the purpose of our show is to provide people with ingredients to brew their own faith in their own context with their own community in ways that bring about flavorful, zestful, adventurous Christian living.
There you go.
That's what we're trying to do.
I liked your version. That was.
Made a choice to walk through the open door. Now I'm overwhelmed than I was before. Ha 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 hard. It's so ha 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 hard. You're there reaching out with an open hand. Can't help but feel like a lesser man. Ha 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 hard. It's so ha 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 hard. Why? But just wanna be.
Young Romans.
Thank you, guys.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the main event. This is a conversation with Reza Aslan, the author of Zealot, the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, as you guys are getting settled back in, we have a couple things we need to take care of first. One is we need an up-close picture.
I know. So you're going to pretend you're saying something awesome.
Yeah.
So, there we go. And your head's in the background. It is totally auto-focusing on yourself.
You're going to want that on your Facebook cover.
You're welcome.
All right. So, is there anything that we should say in introducing you that you think people, may not know? Because, you've been in the news lately, so
I have to start with just a confession because I'm a little bit embarrassed.
Oh.
My publicist told me that this was Krista Tippett's show. I had no.
That happens all the time.
Yeah, so
it's crazy.
Anyway,
I paid him.
All right. So you thought that it would be a good idea to write a book about Jesus.
Well, I figured no one's ever written anything about him.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy doesn't get any attention at all.
Very dusty subject.
No, it's funny too because this is a book that I've been working on for a very, very long time, and it actually started as a thesis in my undergraduate days many, many years ago. And it's just been kind of working its way, through my brain ever since. But I think that part of the reason why people have, liked it or been drawn to it in a way is because it creates, I think, a Jesus that is both familiar and new for a lot of people, and particularly Christians. I mean, I don't know. Listen, I don't know what the media perception is out there that somehow Christians don't like this book. Christians have been overwhelmingly positive about this book. I get a dozen emails a day from Christians telling me that that the book has empowered their faith. They disagree with some of the conclusions.
I think we all do.
Yeah. And obviously they think that this person that I'm describing is also God. But I think that because there's this fundamental, I'm gonna tap into Barry. Every time Barry speaks, I get a headache.
I know.
It's so it's like my mind hurts after hearing him talk. Here is the fundamental paradox of Christianity. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
It's almost impossible to grasp what it means to think of Jesus as both fully God and fully man. What I mean by that is that the God part subsumes the man part. No matter how hard you try as a devout Christian, and I used to be one, so I know what I'm talking about. No matter how hard you try, you can't think of Jesus as just a man, because there's always this kind of safety net. When you try to think about the suffering that he went through, the temptations that he experienced, the powers that he confronted, no matter how hard you try to think of him as just a man going through that, there's always this thing that it's like, well, but he's also God.
So we call that the Clark Kent syndrome.
Yeah.
Right? At any point, he could have unzipped the man suit.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh.
Yeah. You're never worried.
Easy.
You're
Easy.
never worried about Clark.
Oh, yeah.
You're never worried about Clark. You just aren't.
No, I mean...
Like, if Clark is in a situation, you're not like, look out, Clark, because
God
you know...
help us if that man finds a phone booth.
God,
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think that it is interesting to people to suspend a part of their mind for a moment, a part of their beliefs for a moment, and just say, okay, if he is fully God and fully man, what can we know about the fully man part? I mean, he lived in a specific time and place. That time and place actually matters. He does have a context. So regardless of what else he was, he was a product of his time, and that's all I'm trying to do.
I'm interested in one of the things that it's on the second page of your book, but not everyone got that far. So, if Jesus has a context and it just totally blows someone's mind to find out he was Jewish, and but you have a context too, so I'm interested in kind of your relationship with Jesus and coming to faith in high school, it being kind of deconstructed and reformed as you become an academic. And then how did your relationship with Jesus change in your own biography as you became a Muslim? And how did that play out? How did that relationship that led to this book?
I was born in Iran to, a culturally Muslim family, the way so many other people have their faith. I mean, I think the one thing that you learned when you study religions right away is that religion is far more a matter of identity than it is a matter of beliefs and practices. And our identity was Muslim, but, I don't ever remember going to a mosque. I don't really remember. I mean, we celebrated holidays and things like that. When we left in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution and settled in the U.S., this was not a good time to be either Muslim or Iranian. You guys, what are you, like 12? So there was this thing called the Iranian hostage crisis in the 1980s. Anyway, long story. The point is...
Did Reagan fix that?
And Reagan fixed it, exactly. As he fixed everything.
Praise the Lord.
Yes. And so, I spent a good part of the 80s just kind of hiding my culture, hiding my religion, wiping it clear. I mean, I spent from 1980 to 1984 as a Mexican, basically. I learned, I kind of look Mexican. I learned how to break dance. And
do you have an accent?
Yeah, un poquito. And so, I kind of grew up without any kind of real religious instruction, though have always been a deeply spiritual kid, really interested in religions. I mean, I think, honestly, my childhood images of revolutionary Iran seared in my mind the power that religion has to transform a society for good or bad. This was, something that I've never forgotten. When I was 15, I started going to something called Young Life. And went to Woodleaf, a Young Life camp, and heard the gospel story for the first time. And it blew my mind. I had what can only be described as an encounter with Christ. And what I was searching for, a way to express this deep longing for spirituality, suddenly came home to me. Spent the next 4 or 5 years as a Young Life leader and going around, just spreading this message to everyone I met, people who wanted to hear it, people who did not want to hear it. And then when I went to college, I went to a Jesuit university, Santa Clara University, and began to study the Bible in an academic environment. I noticed this chasm, if you will, between the Jesus of history, this man who lived 2,000 years ago in a specific time and place, and the Christ of faith that I had learned about in church. And the only way that I can describe it is that this guy, the Jesus of history, became more real to me, more understandable, more relatable to me. And the more relatable he became, the more distance I felt from the Christ of faith. And And then, so I stopped being a Christian. I don't know how else to put it. I stopped believing in the creed, continued my studies.
Did you change your Facebook status? It's complicated.
There was no Facebook back then. I know it's hard. Yeah,
Reagan invented it.
I didn't even have email. I know, mind blowing. And then, the end of this story is that my professors, particularly some of these amazing Jesuits that I studied with, recognizing that I was feeling sort of spiritually unmoored, said, "Why don't you look to the faith and practice of your forefathers?" Now, I didn't know anything, absolutely anything about Islam, anything about Muhammad. I've never read the Quran before, so I thought, all right, I'll check it out. And the way that I describe it is that it was as though I was being confronted with a language for things that I already believed. I already believed this stuff. I just didn't know there was kind of a name for it. And I had an emotional conversion to Christianity. I had an intellectual conversion to Islam. And I should emphasize, it's very important because, as a scholar of religions, as somebody who studies the religions of the world, it's very hard to take any one religion all that seriously. So when I say that I'm a Muslim, what I mean is that the symbols and metaphors that Islam provides in talking about these ineffable faith experiences, the experience of transcendence, God, humanity, the relationship between creator and creation, the symbols that it uses to describe those things make more sense to me than symbols that other religions do. I don't think Islam is correct and Christianity is incorrect. I don't think Islam is true and other religions are untrue. It's simply the fact that the language of Islam feels more comfortable to me, the way that English feels more comfortable.
So this book that you've written is interesting in so many ways. So we want to just go into layers and layers and layers of it. So Tripp and I come from two very different backgrounds. I come from an evangelical background where we did almost no biblical scholarship. So if somebody comes from kind of my perspective, they will be shocked. There will be almost a whiplash to read a historical approach to Jesus, a scholarly approach. Tripp's from more of a liberal Baptist approach where they integrated scholarship. So on that side, people may be looking back to you saying, yeah, the Jesus Seminar already talked about most of this, right? And so what we want to do is give you a bunch of pairings.
Okay.
So because of the audience that we kind of represent, and have you go at it. So the first is your subtitle. So you said, Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And then you, early on in the book, you contrast that against the Jesus of faith, maybe the Jesus of the Bible, and you make some delineations. Why did you go with that subtitle?
Well, because what I wanted to emphasize is that this is not about the individual that we know as Jesus Christ. That Jesus Christ is an interpretation of an individual, a perfectly valid interpretation, a true interpretation, but nevertheless an interpretation. And that what this book is trying to do is peel back the layer of the Christ as much as possible to get to the core of the person. And also because that's what Jesus was known as. I mean, it's interesting. People ask me, what did people call Jesus when they met him? I'll tell you what they did not call him, Jesus, or Yeshua. They didn't call him that, and the reason that they didn't call him that is because every third person in the first century was named Yeshua. Okay, you can't. If you said Yeshua in a crowded room, 30 people would say, "Yeah." They called him the Nazarene, and the reason that they called him the Nazarene is because the village that he came from was such a podunk crap village with so few people. It was such an inconsequential, immaterial village, a village without a road, without a public bath, without a synagogue, a village made up of a few, 100 homes of mud and brick. That if you said to someone, hey, you know who I saw the other day? Who? The Nazarene. They wouldn't say, which Nazarene? So that's what this is the man we're talking about. And that's why the subtitle.
Okay. So we want to do this thing of things that are in the Bible but not in history to let you talk about your method, and then things that are in history but not in the Bible. Okay? So things that are in the Bible but not in history. The census. Jesus' birth narrative. The reason that Mary and Joseph have to go down and kind of relocate temporarily is that there's a census.
Says, yeah.
You say...
Well, so yes, so the infancy narrative in Luke. Luke has this problem. Some of the prophecies, not all of them, about the Messiah, but some of the prophecies say that the Messiah, as the descendant of King David, has to be born in Bethlehem. So Luke has to get a man known as the Nazarene to Bethlehem to be born there. And so he says that there is this census in the year 6 AD. And it was a census of the entire Roman world. And according to the laws of this census, every subject of Rome had to leave where they were living and go to the birthplace of their father and be counted. And since Joseph's birthplace was Bethlehem, they all get up and go to Bethlehem, and there in a manger next to a bunch of sheep and cows and chickens, Jesus is born. And so the prophecy is fulfilled. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Well, there are some historical problems with that. Number one, there was a census in the year 6 AD, but it wasn't of the Roman world. It was of Judea, Perea, Idumea, and I think that's it. Judea, Perea, and Idumea. Not of Galilee, which is where Jesus lived, first of all. And secondly, we know a lot about Roman taxation law. It turns out that the Romans were pretty good at documentation when it came to things involving money. And we know exactly how the census worked because the purpose of the census was taxation. The purpose of the census was to count your property so that you could be properly taxed for it. The notion that every once in a while, every subject of the entire Roman Empire, the largest empire the world had ever known, had to uproot themselves and their family and travel great distances to the birthplace of their father and to wait there for weeks, perhaps, for a Roman official to show up and count them and their property, which they would have left behind in their place of residence anyway, is what we would refer to as unhistorical. But here's the most important thing. Luke knew that what he was writing was factually unhistorical. He was living under Roman dominion at the time, so a generation or two removed from the date that he's referring to. Luke's audience knew that what Luke was writing was factually unhistorical. They were still subjects of Rome. They were counted every once in a while. They knew what the rules were. They didn't care. That's the key to understanding how to read the Gospels. What we understand as history, as an accumulation of empirically verifiable facts and dates, is wholly a product of the modern world. That definition of history is barely 300 years old. What the ancient mind meant when they said history, what Luke meant when he said history, had very little to do with uncovering facts. It was about revealing truths. Everyone who read, the original audience who read that story, would have been utterly unconcerned with what we refer to as its historical inaccuracies. All they would have cared about is the truth being revealed in that story. And what is that truth? That Jesus is the descendant of King David, the anointed one, here to recreate David's kingdom on earth, the Messiah. We have lost track of the way in which the Gospels were meant to be read because we are a product of the scientific revolution. We were told 150 years ago that which is true is that which can be empirically verified. So what did we say? Well then, if the Bible is true, every word of it must be empirically verifiable. That's not how it was meant to be read. It's not how it was written.
So the question of taxes is interesting because, unlike Bo, and I was a senior in high school, my dad gave me a copy of Meeting Jesus Again for the first time, and I thought, finally, I can be a Christian again without crossing my fingers.
I was reading Superman.
I was into Uncanny X-Men then, but for me, that whole hypostatic union, if we didn't use the Clark Kent earlier, the way that you get the whole human and divine thing in, they argued about it in councils, and they're like, what is this? Let's invent a new word, hypostatic union. That sounds religious enough. And they're like, we believe that. And that was just overbearing. But then all of a sudden, when I realized, Luke was trying to get at something that's true and really wasn't worried about connecting these dots. So you don't have to have Jesus cleanse the temple like at the beginning of his ministry in John and then do it 2 different ways at the end and all that kind of stuff. When I found out that my Bible wasn't broken, then all of a sudden that story becomes politically charged. All of a sudden, the empire that kills Jesus makes prophecy get fulfilled by trying to oppress God's people by taxing them. Right. And then all of a sudden, I remember I was reading the book, and Marcus Borg goes, "This is when a good Jew hearing this story laughs."
Exactly.
So maybe you can say a little bit about when you're looking in your book, there are all these places that when you start to kind of peel back those layers, all of a sudden you get in on the joke or you get in on the critique. Yeah. It's not a threat to the faith or a threat to the text. Not at all.
It's
an opening.
Shouldn't be. I mean, first of all, look.
Except my mother-in-law.
If your faith collapses because you found out that there's an error, because you found out that Matthew says Jesus was born in 4 BC and Luke says he was born in 6 CE, your faith's in trouble. Okay? Your faith isn't in the Bible. I've never understood this, even now or even when I was a Christian. People were like, I believe in the Quran. I believe in the Bible. What are you talking about? These aren't things to believe in. They are signposts to God. That's what they are. And I think that's where the problem comes, is confusing religion for faith. Insofar as that Marcus Borgian moment, for me, it actually happened in this moment. You actually brought it up, it kind of as a joke, but it's not a joke. It happened the moment that I understood what it means that Jesus was a Jew. We all know that Jesus was a Jew. We say it all the time. Jesus was a Jew. You know. Wait, that's not a surprise. It's really quiet. People are like, what?
Oh, what?
What?
Hold on a second.
Everyone agrees. Most everyone agrees that Jesus was a Jew. But for me, the turning point came when I understood the consequences of that belief. And the consequences are that everything he said or did has to be understood in its Jewish context. That the only God that he would have understood is the God of the Hebrew Bible. The only scriptures that he would have had any kind of understanding of, any kind of experience of, was the Torah and the prophets. The only religion that he would have had any encounter with is Second Temple Judaism, the Jewish cult as it was referred to. And that suddenly changes everything. So when Jesus says something, when he does something, you have to refrain from trying to divorce it from its Jewish context if you want to sort of understand what the historical Jesus meant by it. That does not invalidate the interpretations that have arisen from Jesus in any way, shape, or form. But what we're talking about is, if you want to get to the root of this guy, this person who lived 2,000 years ago, no matter what else you think of him, you can't forget that he was a Jew.
So we talked about things that were in the Bible but not in history. Let's talk about things that are in history but not in the Bible. Let's talk about Sepphoris. So there's this city.
It's not on the periodic table. I saw people were going
so
to check.
There's this city that had to have played a major role in Jesus' younger life, especially as a day laborer. Some people say a carpenter, probably a stonemason, a worker of some type. A builder of some type. It is nearly undoubtable that he worked, or him and his father worked on this thing. And yet, it never shows up in Scripture, and so therefore most Christians don't know about it.
Right.
But the role that it would have played in his Jewishness and for those who would have written about him a generation later is shocking.
Absolutely. So what Bo's referring to is around it's hard to say, but around 4 BC, around the time that Jesus is born, there's this big revolt that takes place all across the empire because Herod the Great dies. Everybody hated Herod, and as soon as he died, this dam of anger arises, and there's revolts and revolutions everywhere and all this stuff. And one of these characters is a man by the name of Judas the Galilean, who called himself the Messiah, a very revolutionary person who really popularized the concept of zeal as an animating force. He's going around, he's causing trouble and doing all these things. He breaks into the fortress at Sepphoris. Sepphoris is this it's sort of the big, at this point, the biggest town in Galilee, the biggest city in Galilee. It's a commercial hub. He breaks into the armory, probably with the help of some sympathetic Sephoreans, steals the weapons, and uses those weapons to launch a full-scale war against Rome. Gets cut down very, very easily. 2,000 of his followers get crucified. But Rome, which tends not to forget a slight.
Luckily, humanity's evolved now.
Right, yeah.
Now we go to Congress to vote about it.
Rome decides, as punishment for allowing Judas the Galilean to take the weapons from Sepphoris, they're going to raze the city to the ground, slaughter every man, and sell the women and children into slavery. And they do this. Very shortly after that, Herod's son, Antipas, decides that he's going to rebuild Sepphoris from the ground up. It's just ashes. And he's going to build it from the ground up into his first seat, the first seat of his tetrarchy. And basically every single stonemason, every worker, every day laborer, everybody from miles around pours into this city to help rebuild it. Jesus at this point is 15 years old. I mean, he is at the height of his trade. And Nazareth is about an hour away. In fact, to this day, if you go to the ruins of Sepphoris, it's gorgeous. If you go to the ruins of Sepphoris and you look up, there's Nazareth on the hill. And yes, it is almost certain that from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week, he and his brothers and his father, everyone, would make the hour-long trek into this city and would build these amazing palatial mansions. I mean, you've got the ruins are incredible. These aqueducts running through the streets. Nazareth didn't have a single bath, not even one that everyone could share. In Sepphoris, most of the houses had their own private baths. I mean, that's the difference between these two. These are wealthy, cosmopolitan, Hellenized Jews. They are sort of the opposite of what Jesus is. And it's also this kind of mixed city. There are Arabs there are Syrians, there are Romans, there are Greeks. And pretty much from the day that he starts this job, probably around 15 or so, to the day that he leaves for Judea and John the Baptist, that's 15 years or so, this is where he works. This is his life. Why isn't it mentioned in the Gospels? Because before that moment in which Jesus shows up on the banks of the Jordan River to be baptized by John, we know nothing about him at all. Everything ever written about Jesus before that moment is, well, the word for it is mythology. That's not a bad word. Mythology is a good word. For some reason, it's become synonymous with falsehood. That's not it at all. But it's just mythology until that moment. So there is the major city in Galilee is mentioned a lot in the Bible. It's called Tiberias. So in about 28 CE, 26, 28 CE AD, I'm sorry, Herod Antipas abandons Sepphoris and builds a new palace in Tiberias. And you hear about Tiberias all the time because by the time Tiberias exists, Jesus has entered history. Before then, he hasn't. So no one writes about Sepphoris.
So what, when you start getting the image of a kind of conquered and oppressed people walking down a hill every day to build very, very nice houses for their kind of the half Jew, half Roman ruler who's working for the man and keeping the people down. Like when you start thinking of that being 15 years ingrained into his body, what's going on if you leave that to go hang out with John the Baptist and then later call yourself a Messiah, which is Trinity then. Like there are more than one of them. And so maybe you can say, like, what is that? What are you thinking as a historian when you go from rocking it at Sepphoris for 15 years and then you're going to hang out with John? He's kind of crazy.
In the desert, yeah. Here's what you need to know about John the Baptist. He was the most famous Jew in first century Palestine. I mean, let's say second, because Herod the Great was pretty famous. So he was the second most famous Jew in first century. Everybody knew who John the Baptist was. What he was doing on the banks of the Jordan River and in other areas as well was wholly unique. It's not that baptism didn't exist in that time. It did. There were all kinds of different ways of using water rituals for a whole host of purposes, but not what John was doing. This notion of a one-time baptism that, if you believe the Gospel of Mark, cleanses you of your sin, if you believe the historian Josephus, enters you into the true nation of Israel, was unheard of at the time. I mean, so it was so innovative. And he was so popular that even in lowly Nazareth, people had heard about this guy. Why Jesus, at this point in his life, suddenly abandons his home, his family, everything he's ever known. This guy has never left Galilee to cross the Judean desert into John's group, to become one of John's disciples, which is what baptism in this particular case meant. Not everybody who was baptized by John became a disciple. Many of them went back to their homes, but Jesus did not. He stuck around with John, which meant that he was a disciple of John's. Who knows? I mean, it's hard to know what compelled that action. What I think is fairly clear, however, is that by the time John is arrested and then ultimately executed, Jesus has inherited his ministry. You know, when you look at the Gospels, the first words of Jesus is perfectly mimic John's. The first actions of his, according to the Gospel of John, was baptism. He's baptizing along with John. The very concept of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, it's quite clearly borrowed from John. Even the Lord's Prayer, right? The Lord's Prayer, the disciples say, "Teach us how to pray as John taught you." So even that fundamental thing is all John. But what Jesus does with this kind of seed of an idea, because John never referred to himself as Messiah. People thought he was the Messiah, but he never referred to himself as such, is he encapsulates it into this messianic identity, which comes to this last part of your question. In the first century, simply saying the words, "I am the Messiah," is a treasonable offense. The Messiah means the anointed one. His chief function as the descendant of King David is to recreate the kingdom of David on earth, to usher in the reign of God. Well, if you're ushering in the reign of God, you are ushering out the reign of Caesar, which is why everybody... And
You're saying that might have been a problem.
It could have been a slight problem, yeah. Which is why everybody who said, "I am the Messiah," and there were many people, Hezekiah the bandit chief, Simon of Perea, Judas the Galilean, Menachem, Judas's grandson, Simon bar Giora, Simon bar Kokhba, everybody who said, "I am the Messiah," was killed for it.
Well, I think this is where you start twisting things around, because Jesus came to die on the cross to forgive us of our sins so we can go to heaven. And now you've turned it into political type things, which is what I heard on the internet you were going to do tonight. And
they never lie.
I know.
No.
They never lie.
So, but see, here the thing is, like, we know, like, if you just take Religion 101, you're like 2 weeks on Jesus.
Right.
You find out that pretty much everyone that spends their life studying it was like, yeah, he got axed because they thought he was kind of politically crazy, like trying to stick it. So maybe you could just, baby step us in there, because right now I have some friends that are just getting really worried. They were like, oh, he's quoting the Bible. Now he's quoting other Jew names, other messiahs I have never heard of.
You seem to know a lot about Jesus for a guy who doesn't believe in Jesus.
I believe Jesus existed.
So what? Maybe you can try to unpack what this identity of Messiah in the kingdom of God meant in context, and not in the Bible that I read.
Step one, understand that there is no differentiation between politics and religion in Jesus' time. People keep saying, oh, I get what you're doing. You're turning Jesus' words into a political thing. They're one and the same. I am the Messiah is equally a religious and a political statement. They are one and the same. They cannot be divorced in any way, shape, or form. Everything Jesus said and did. In fact, his entire ministry, which is seen as religious, was simultaneously political. I mean, look at the Beatitudes, which, often we look at and we think of as this kind of, it comes across as a kind of utopian fantasy that he's talking about, right? Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth, and blessed are the hungry, for they shall be fed.
See, Barry, there's your LA spirituality.
Blessed are the meek, Yeah. Anyway, the point is, and by the way, first of all, we always forget the other part of the Beatitudes, right? The woes, which is the flip side of that. Woe to the fed, for they shall be made hungry. Woe to the rich, for they shall be made poor. This notion that Jesus is talking about here, the reversal of the social order, the first shall be last, the last shall be first, is a statement of revolution. What you are saying is, I am here to define a new world order in which all the rich people will be made poor and all the poor people will be made rich, in which the hungry will be made fed and those who are fed will be made hungry. That you can enjoy the spiritual aroma of that a little bit, but put yourself in first century Palestine, okay? Put yourself in the position of the poor and the hungry. That sounds awesome. Sounds awesome. Now put yourself in the position of the wealthy and the fed. That is treason at best. Okay? It's a call to revolution at best. So I'm not saying, hey, let's look at Jesus as a political figure. What I'm saying is understand that every religious thing that Jesus says has a political dimension.
All right, so we've set the stage. We're going to start to burrow down a little bit. There are two words in the book you take umbrage with about how they're translated. Usually when we tell the Easter story, Jesus gets crucified between two thieves. You say, thieves is a little weak.
Thieves is a weak word, for the word lestai. Lestai it can mean thieves, but it doesn't. It means bandits. Bandits was the most common term in Jesus' time for an insurrectionist, for a rebel. Barabbas is called a bandit. When the cohort of Roman soldiers come to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, which I have to always remind people is not a garden. I mean, there's not like a fountain there or something. It's a forest. It's where you go to hide when people are looking for you. When they come to arrest him, he says, "Are you here to arrest me like a bandit, like a lestis?" Exactly. So it starts with this fundamental fact, which is that crucifixion was a punishment that Rome reserved almost exclusively for the crime of sedition, for crimes against the state, insurrection, rebellion, sedition. Those are the things that you could be crucified for. This was a serious punishment. In fact, it wasn't even a capital punishment. It was often the case that Rome would kill you first and then crucify you. The purpose of crucifixion was to be a deterrent against rebellion against the state. So if you know nothing else, absolutely nothing else about Jesus, except that he was crucified, you know enough to at the very least begin to question the sort of popular image of him as nothing but this pacifistic preacher of good works with no interest in the cares of this world. To be perfectly frank, that Jesus would have gone totally unnoticed by Rome.
So this has been fun so far. And it's been very
fun for me.
Yeah, it's been very.
We even got him to dance.
It's been very ironic, I think. And so as we keep burrowing down, there are a couple things that we are a little suspicious about. So, number one, the title of the book, Zealot, but you clarify when you're talking about Jesus' disciples that the zealot, kind of out of order, it's anachronistic, because the party, the zealots, wouldn't have shown up for like 30 years after that.
That's right.
But then people are a little confused, like, well, then how is Jesus a zealot? And it's because you're using this word zeal in kind of a camouflage way.
Well, so zealotry was a widespread phenomenon in Jesus' time. I mean, most Jews would have proudly claimed to be zealous for the Lord. All the great biblical heroes, prophets, and kings were all known for their zealousness for the Lord. Zeal is not just a word. It's actually a biblical doctrine in the Hebrew Bible. It means something very specific. It means an uncompromising devotion to the Torah, to the law of Moses. It means a refusal to serve any master save the master of the universe. Certainly any human master, but any master save the master of the universe. And most of all, it means a devotion to the sole sovereignty of God, which if you want to sort of take the entire Torah and fundamentally make it one thing, it's the first law. The Lord thy God is one. The concept of God as the sole sovereign is fundamental, not just to Judaism, but certainly to this conception of zealotry. So, as I say, many people would proudly in Jesus' time call themselves zealots. But there were a group of zealots who took the idea of zeal to its logical conclusion, which is that you cannot live in a holy land that is being occupied by a heathen pagan empire. The Deuteronomy cannot be any clearer about this. Okay, this is a land that must be cleansed of all heathens and dedicated exclusively to the chosen people. And so, throughout the first century, groups of zealots would arise against Rome and collapse. Arise against Rome and collapse. Arise against Rome.
Or be put down.
And be put down. Yeah. That's what I mean by collapse. That's a nice way of putting it. Be slaughtered. Slaughtered to a man.
I was feeling like you were describing waves.
Right.
Yeah. Zeal waves.
Until the year 66, when it works. When these groups of zealots convince the rest of the Jews to rise up against Rome, and it works. It works. They kick the Romans out of the Holy Land. It's a miracle. They keep them at bay for about 3 or 4 years, and then the Romans show up and kill everybody.
But that political party, right, the ones that carried the sheath,
starts in 66. Right.
So you're the Sicarii, right? Is that the...
Well, the Sicarii were a group of zealots.
Okay.
Yes, but they were separate from the zealot party.
And the famous part of the story that you tell is the day that the high priest was actually murdered by...
the high priest Jonathan is murdered
part of the
by a
zealot
member,
party.
Right, one of the Sicarii, yeah.
But people aren't supposed to think that Jesus was a part of that group.
No, Jesus is not a Sicarii. No, not at all. No, there are... No.
See, I'm not the only one.
So what I'm saying is that, so zealotry, again, comes in, the sentiment is the same. The ideology is the same. The methodology that you use to enact the ideology of the sole sovereignty of God is different for everyone. You know, whether it's revolution or whether it's assassination or whether it's a political party or whatever the case may be. Right. The argument that I'm making is that Jesus, as a zealot with a lowercase z, not the zealot party that doesn't show up until 66, that Jesus' teachings and his actions are deeply emblematic of this widespread biblical principle of zealotry, the chief function of which was the establishment of the sole sovereignty of God. In other words, the removal of the Roman occupation.
Okay.
So I think that for a lot of people here are thinking, well, yeah, Jesus was zealot, but he was nonviolent. He was kind of more like MLK. And the violence were kind of things that erupted and pushed back to his disciples and the kingdom of God and the way it's being described. And the whole notion of zealotry and violence kind of gets played out. And until I read the book, when I just read the internet, I found out that you thought Jesus was carrying around swords, killing people, and that was his plan.
That's what people think for some reason.
So maybe you can clarify that a little bit, because nice, enlightened, progressive Christians, we love a nonviolent Jesus who just wants to turn the cheek all the way to the eschaton. So
no, look, it's absolutely. I think that there's no historical evidence whatsoever that Jesus espoused violence against Rome. It just doesn't exist in there. But I think that his views on violence were a lot more complex than the kind of celestial spirit that he's become. Not just in his actual words, and for instance, warning his disciples to arm themselves before they go hiding from the Roman authorities in Gethsemane, but beyond that, if Jesus was serious about what zealotry required, if he meant what he said about establishing the kingdom of God on earth, he must have known what every other claimant to the Messiah knew, which is that doesn't come except through force. What that force meant, I'm not sure if Jesus himself had any true conception of. And by the way, he wasn't the only one. I mean, a very famous Messiah, Athronges, the shepherd boy, who put a diadem on his head and declared himself Messiah, he too did not espouse open violence against Rome. So he wasn't the only one who thought that way. But I think that it is important to understand that Jesus was not a fool. I love how you said in MLK. We do this all the time. We want, because Gandhi and MLK were inspired by Jesus, we think that Jesus was like Gandhi and MLK. There's no such thing as a nonviolent movement in Jesus' time. There are no sit-ins, okay? Jesus doesn't go to the temple and sit down and say, we're not leaving until Rome leaves, okay? The concept does not exist. It does not exist, okay? So you can rely on God. You can rely on God, that God will be there for us, that God will fight our wars the way he fought the wars of the Israelites. When you read the Hebrew Bible, it's God who destroys the armies, of Canaan and the Amalekites and the Jebusites and the et cetera, et cetera. But I think to think that Jesus was just sort of this kind of pacifistic, turn the other cheek, not interested in force, had that kind of is anachronistic. It's us putting our views upon him.
And, one of the things I think is interesting is that, and as someone who spends their time teaching all the different religions, is that Christianity, right, maybe a little shocked to find out Jesus just isn't from Woodstock. But as a religion in its history, it's been wonderfully gifted at being violent, and then also having an eschatology where God kicks more ass than any of the other religions. It's you better join up or watch out. Yeah. Eternal conscious torment. And so
the book of Revelations, Jesus is a warrior with a bloody sword.
And Aquinas clarifies that some of the enjoyment, this is a nerd moment, but he clarifies that some of the enjoyment in heaven is getting to hear the cries of the damned as they're tortured.
Right.
So what is going on?
Amen. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
If you were able to take a step back, because you're touching on all of our my little Jesus in my heart is getting upset by what you're saying. So as a scholar of religion,
and you don't want that.
No, because I'm not violent. I'm not nonviolent. Man, that's confusing. So what's going on in religions where the relationship to violence shifts over time and in culture, and what's going on when we're able to keep Jesus a hippie but also be painfully violent when we're in power? What's that look like, just if you're looking at the religion and its story?
It starts with this. We have to stop being under the mistaken assumption that prophets create religions. Jesus did not invent Christianity. Jesus was a Jew. He reformed Judaism. His followers created Christianity. Muhammad did not invent Islam. Muhammad was not a Muslim. Muhammad was a Hanif, if anything. But the point is that he was there to reform the religion of his day and age. It was his followers who created Islam. Siddhartha Gautama did not invent Buddhism. He was a Hindu, not a Buddhist. He reformed Hinduism. His followers turned it into Buddhism. Religions are man-made institutions, literally, man-made institutions that are created by the followers of prophets who are tasked with this Herculean responsibility to kind of figure out what that was all about. What was that? That was crazy. That whole 3 years with Jesus, that was weird, right? We should write it down and turn it into a religion. Here's the thing with religion, however, is that like any ideology, it is fundamentally predicated upon the creation of collective identities. Religion is all about who is us and who is them. It's probably the most simplistic way of defining who is us and who is them. Do you pray like me? Do you fast like me? You're me. You don't? You're them. And while that is true of any ideology, the problem is that when you bring the conception of absolutism into it, and this is particularly true in monotheism, which tends to not just be interested in the concept of one God, but tends to be interested in the concept of one truth. If there's one God, then there's just one path to God. If there's one path to God, there's only one truth. And if there's only one truth, anything else is not just wrong, it's demonic. It's anti-God, by definition. If it's not this, then it's anti-God. And so it provides, I think, it sort of lubricates all religious traditions towards violence, because the second easiest means of collective identity formation is violence. Are you on my side of the bunker or on the other side of the bunker? If you're on my side of the bunker, you're me. If you're wearing the same uniform as I am, you're me. And if you're not, you're them. And all of human experience from the moment that we came out of our caves, all of human experience has been predicated upon the formation of collective identity. Nowadays we call it nationalism, but it's the same thing. Tribalism, ethnicity, religion. That's why we have these conflicts. Religion isn't any different than any one of those other ideologies, which is what always bothers me about the whole new atheism movement, right? This idea that religion is responsible for acts of evil committed in religion's name. I am actually totally cool with that argument, as long as you're willing to expand it to everything else. If you're willing to blame nationalism for fascism, if you're willing to blame socialism for communism, if you're willing to blame science for eugenics, I'll let you blame religion for religious violence.
That sounded very Jesus-y. I liked it.
Well,
That was a compliment.
yeah. So earlier when you were telling your story and your kind of conversion experience, you said it was an experience that could only be called an experience with Christ.
An encounter with Christ.
So people may be shocked that a Muslim scholar would say what you said about the resurrection. So maybe you could relate both like how you look at the resurrection accounts and stuff as a historian, but also as religious people that have experiences that are shaped and contextualized by their religious context.
Yeah, the resurrection is a very tricky thing for a historian to talk about. Obviously.
But the payoff
Because
huge.
it's not in videotape?
Yeah. I mean, look, by definition, you are talking about something that is beyond history. It's an ahistorical event. And you could, if you wanted to, just say, well, that's just absurd. I mean, the idea of a man rising from the dead after 3 days is just stupid, so let's just move on. And that's fine. I believe in God, which means that I am open to some pretty absurd possibilities. As a person of faith, my idea of what the resurrection is cloudy, right? As a historian, all I can do is talk about what history allows me to talk about, which is not the resurrection, but the resurrection claim. That's a historical event. It's a historical event that people said, I saw Jesus. I saw him. He was alive. That is something that you can actually sink your teeth into as a historian and talk about. And the fact of the matter is that this was a very, very early part of the belief system of these Jews, and they were all Jews, who followed Jesus. And you can't ignore that. I mean, you'd like to. You'd like to just say, it's just some weird thing. And a lot of people do, but the fact of the matter is that the fervent belief of these people that they had a mystical encounter with the risen Jesus is ultimately what transformed this tiny, and I can't emphasize that enough, tiny Jewish movement for national liberation into the largest religion in the world. That can't be ignored.
I want to say thank you we have been so looking forward to talking with you about this book, and so I feel like we did a really good job at that. But there's some other things we want to talk to you about with our time we have left.
All right.
So we're going to turn the
Let's
corner.
do it. Okay.
So, do you want to end with a name game or start with it?
Oh, let's do that first.
All right, go.
Okay.
We have this thing we like to do with scholars. We just like to throw out names and just you say the first thing.
Well,
that
we
comes to
also
your head.
thought it would help his street cred. We're going to just edit this one out onto a YouTube video so that people know you have something to say about other scholars. You have footnotes in your book, and there are references to things. I've heard that you said there were. So we play this game, and we've played it with all the people on this list but one. And you basically tell them all the other kind of New Testament historical Jesus scholars' names, and you drop 30 seconds, 45 seconds of whatever you want.
All right.
N.T. Wright told personal stories. Crossan told me what he thought the other person thought that was wrong. Borg said his favorite thing.
That's usually what happens.
Yeah, so you can do whatever you want.
All
right. You ready?
Oh boy, okay.
Yeah, you better get your safety belt on. Don't worry, we'll edit it. So it looks like they're just flying off your tongue. All right, we'll start. John Dominique Crossan.
Actually said that he yawned at my book.
Whoa!
Yawned.
Yeah.
I think he told the Washington Post, I yawned.
That means he was reading it long enough to have to yawn.
Yeah.
All right, so Marcus Borg.
I actually keep running into people who have just run into Marcus Borg. It's this weird thing. He's like my Snuffleupagus. You know what I mean? I'm sure he exists.
That's tweetable.
I'm sure he exists, but every time I show up, he leaves.
N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright I like N.T. Wright a lot, and I really, really like the stuff that he writes about resurrection especially. But I guess if I were playing this game, my brother-in-law, who's an awesome evangelical pastor in Pittsburgh, worships N.T. Wright. So, Dr. Wright, if you happen to be listening, you want to make a guy's day, call me. I'll hook you up with my brother-in-law.
Matchmaking. All right, Bart Ehrman.
This is going to sound like a jerky thing to say.
Oh, well,
and it's not.
He's played the
I'll
game
get my
before,
Twitter
too.
ready.
And
Go.
it's not meant to be. But I keep getting emails from people saying, your book is so much like Bart Ehrman's book. How come you don't quote him or anything? I've never read a Bart Ehrman book. And I don't mean that in a mean way. It's just I don't have anything. I don't have a problem. I'm sure I would like to. I'd like to find out. Apparently he thinks the same thing I do. But I've never actually read a Bart.
That's really interesting.
There are quite a few things where y'all are similar. Anyway, so Horsley.
Oh yeah, Richard Horsley, man. I'm sure Richard Horsley doesn't like me. I'm certain of it. But I love him. Because basically everything that I know about sort of first century apocalypticism and certainly the conception of banditry and social banditry I know from Richard Horsley, but I always take it to the next level, and I think that's where he would get annoyed with me. So in other words, he writes all this stuff. This is now we're going to get into the weeds. Here's Richard Horsley's
California.
thing, is he's like, we have to separate eschatology and apocalypticism. And we have to make a differentiation between kingly messiahs and priestly messiahs and these various conceptions. And my response to him is, yeah, I'm certain that an illiterate peasant from Galilee made those kinds of distinctions, Like, I'm the Messiah. Well, but do you mean kingly apocalyptic? Or do you mean priestly eschatological? You
don't think that happened?
No, I don't think that happened.
See, you make it sound like when someone decides they want to become a messiah, it's like making a new Dungeons and Dragons character.
Right.
And you're
right,
like, choose your race, then you got to choose
exactly.
your... Yeah.
No.
Oh.
So I think Horsley would say that I simplify his arguments, which is true, but I simplify it because that's how it would have been understood in Jesus' time.
John Mayer.
Okay, all right. Now we're messing around here. John Mayer. I met John Mayer when he was not even done with his first book. Okay, and it's now 5 volumes, right? A Marginal Jew. I met him when I was like a freshman or a sophomore in college, and it's like these geek moments where you're like, oh my God, it's John Mayer. Nobody cares. It's just like this old priest. Like nobody cares. And I got to ask him a question, and it was a smart question. And afterwards, my professor came up to me and was like, "Way to go!" It was like the greatest thing that ever happened to me at that time. But John Mayer, as I say in this book, is really in many ways the impetus for it, because he makes a statement at the beginning of his first volume, A Marginal Jew, about why he calls it that. And what he says is, here's a fundamental fact about the historical Jesus. Take away the Bible, and there is no sign of this man at all. Nothing, except for this tiny throwaway clause in Josephus that is totally meaningless, and Josephus doesn't even take it seriously. In any case, he's talking about somebody else that's much more important. He just mentions Jesus. And a lot of people say, well, that's all the proof you need to know that this guy didn't exist. And Mayer's argument is, no, it's miraculous that there's this tiny throwaway clause, because what you are talking about is an inconsequential, illiterate, uneducated, poor, marginal Jew. The fact that a historian in the year 94 would have even bothered mentioning him is phenomenal. And that becomes the basis for his book. Mm-hmm. And I take that idea and sort of run with it.
Cool. One more?
William Lane Craig. He's a Christian philosopher.
Right. This is the Fox News Christian philosopher.
Yeah.
Now I remember.
You're welcome.
Now I remember. Here's the thing about William Lane Craig, is that his name? Is that
he uses all 3.
I obviously had never heard of him.
Change your life.
But afterwards, I got a lot of emails from people being like, dude, this dude is awesome. You should really check him out. He's a little bit crazy, right? I think, right?
I made a joke about him once, and I got emails.
Oh, so then
like, you
never mind.
To him and my podcast.
Never mind. But a friend of mine who writes for magazines was like, I want to write an article about somebody, like, some religious person. And I was like, how about William Lane Craig? That guy seems like somebody worthy of a profile.
Boom.
But I don't know anything about him except that he does not like me. Yeah.
I wanted to know what you thought of. What was your favorite performance at the VMAs?
Yeah. I still, and I've tried, and I'm dating myself, I'm still trying to figure out, what is twerking? Like, what is that? Is that
I'll show you later.
Is that a thing? That it actually has a name?
Yeah,
Twerk?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
I did not know
dictionary.
that.
It's worth knowing. All right. So we just have 2 last questions in the lightning round.
Okay.
So we have to ask, do you think that all of this controversy that's been stirred up and all this stuff, there has to be a level of some academic jealousy, right?
A level?
I do understatement as well as twerking.
I think it was. I'm fairly certain it was Henry Kissinger who said that the politics of academia are so vicious because the stakes are so small.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like they're really worried that one, like you write in like multiple sentences in a row that are complete and readable, and that people read your book, and that their students read your book and not the books they assigned.
Yeah.
So they then ask you about it.
Here's
like
the thing.
academics.
By the way, I've been dealing with this since No God But God. I mean, I've been dealing with this for a very long time. And I'm okay with it. And I talk to a lot of university students, a lot of sort of graduate students getting ready for this kind of field. The reason that there's so much anti-intellectualism in the United States, the reason that it became almost impossible for Fox News to fathom that you could be a scholar of religion and that you could just have, as much as is humanly possible, an objective view about, religion in some way, is our fault. It's because we spend all of our time talking to each other in these dusty libraries about crap that nobody cares about, in this bizarre language that makes no sense. I mean, I remember sitting around in my doctoral, one of my programs in my doctoral program, and people were talking about the problems of essentializing the sacred. And I was like, what are you talking about? They're like, essentializing the sacred.
You don't want to do that.
I was like, you mean believing in God? Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah, essentializing the sacred. It's like, that's not a phrase. Stop using that. Okay? Do you want to know why people don't trust us? It's because you say things like essentializing the sacred. Stop saying that.
That's fantastic.
So I'm cool with it. I'm fine. Bring on the attack.
So I want to peer pressure you now. I want you to write fiction. Because I enjoyed reading your book and you write well, and I know that you also do write fiction. So I thought, well, we know there's a hunch out there for like Jesus, historical fiction, and what about the Lost Guide to Da Vinci's Code or something like that, where then you like come up with like real conspiracies in history, and it's like historically based crazy religious conspiracies.
Well, I am actually working on a novel now.
Ooh.
It's about how...
Could you put a character in there named Tripp?
It's about Tripp, yeah.
It is. Two P's.
It's about how Jesus was actually married to Mary Magdalene, and it was hidden, and then Leonardo da Vinci discovered it, and then there's this weird like Tom Hanks character who comes in later on.
But it's after he started losing his hair.
It's gonna be really good, yeah. And like chubby Tom Hanks too. It's gonna be really good. I'm really I think it's gonna be a real hit.
So we have time for a couple questions from the audience. So Rebecca has the first one.
So one of the things you talk about in your book is the way that Paul sort of took the historical Jesus and he reinterpreted and contextualized his life and created what we know today as Christianity. I'm wondering about some of the Gospels that didn't make it into the canon, and specifically like Thomas, Mary, and Philip. They seem to offer different interpretations of Jesus and who he was. What do you think, does looking at those sort of alternate Christianities, or what Bart Ehrman calls lost Christianities, does that give us a more insight into who the historical Jesus was?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. They are certainly incredibly valuable in helping us understand the multiplicity of ways in which people understood who Jesus was. But they are not helpful at all in understanding the historical Jesus. I mean, you're talking about documents that were written primarily in the 2nd and 3rd, and even in all the way to the 4th centuries. The Gospel of Thomas is probably the closest that we have. Some scholars place it to sort of the first half of the 2nd century, which would mean that it was written not that long after the Gospel of John. The rest of them are not very helpful when it comes to the historical Jesus, but then again, neither is John. But they are very valuable because they show exactly that this concept of lost Christianity, so many different ways of thinking about who Jesus was until it became Roman Orthodoxy.
Okay, just as we're getting to a last question, do we want to say that there are books that have been brought here? If you want to pick up the book and follow this line of research and reasoning, they're on the back table for $27. We are going out after this, if you want to go to the Smith House with us, to continue the conversation. And just before the band comes to play us out, we have time for one more question. Okay.
I'm almost to page 2, like Tripp, and so maybe you address this in the book later after page 2.
No, everything happens in the first 2 pages.
Good. That's why it's selling so well. I think people can really get through it. If Jesus is this marginal guy, all but unknown, how do we end up with Christianity? Like, how do we end up him being so important when there's dozens of other messiahs who end up crucified?
Some end up crucified. Some get their heads chopped off.
However,
yeah.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. I think it has less to do with anything Jesus himself said or did, or though what he said and did was extraordinary, remarkable, worthy of following, than it did with how his followers reinterpreted that. So you mentioned all these other messiahs. They all had essentially the same, more or less, the same goal as Jesus, though different methods of bringing about that goal. And they all failed. If you die, and especially if you're crucified, but if you die, if you say you're the Messiah and you die and you have not reestablished the kingdom of David, you're not the Messiah. It's as simple as that. We call all these other messiahs failed messiahs or false messiahs. We call Jesus the real Messiah. But according to the strictures of Judaism and the definitions of Messiah that are offered by Judaism, Jesus was as successful a Messiah as all these other messiahs. And yet, 2,000 years later, we have forgotten about all of those other ones, and only one of them is still called Messiah. And the reason for that has to do with this fundamental decision that was made by Jesus' followers, as I said, as a result of this mystical experience that they had, which is that either Jesus wasn't the Messiah and they were wrong, and they should all go back to their farms and villages and fisheries like the followers of every other failed Messiah, or what we thought what the Messiah was wrong, that our understanding of Messiah is wrong. And what then begins, and this is, by the way, the simplest way of this, is a much more complex story, but this is the we're out of time version of it. What starts at that moment is this long process whereby the very function and definition of the Messiah changes for these groups of Jews. And it changes to match the facts of Jesus' life and death. And that concept of Messiah becomes divorced from its Jewish context. And as it becomes divorced from its Jewish context, it becomes more universal. And as it becomes more universal, it becomes far more appealing to non-Jews. And the more non-Jews begin to accept this principle and join this movement, the more the movement itself becomes less and less Jewish and ultimately becomes what we now refer to as Christianity. So that's the simple answer to that.
I got bribed into a bonus question.
Okay, so all this is great as a pastor hearing these conversations, but I'm also a Los Angelino, and since you went to Santa Clara, do you know Steve Nash, and how many games will he play for the Lakers?
I graduated with Steve Nash. Okay. By the way, Steve and I took a Bible class together. He was really bad at it. Really bad.
I took an Islam class with Chris Paul.
I don't know who that is,
The
but
Clippers point guard.
the Clippers?
Best point guard
Is that
in the NBA.
a basketball team? I'm sorry. Anyway.
There's your Los Angeles
yes.
street cred moment.
Steve Nash.
Will you all help me thank Reza Aslan?